It is just before dawn in Amboseli, Kenya. The herd is still asleep, bodies pressed together in the dark, breathing slow. 60 elephants. A family that has moved together, mourned together, raised calves together for decades. And then one of them gets up. She is 62 years old. Her name, given by the researchers who have tracked her since 1975, is Echo. She moves quietly, which is unusual for an elephant. She doesn't wake anyone. She doesn't make a sound. She walks to the edge of the group and pauses there for a moment, facing outward into the dark. And then she walks away. The herd doesn't follow. They don't call after her. They just let her go. Echo was found 3 days later, alone, several kilometers from where the family had been sleeping. She had lain down in the shade of an acacia tree. She had died there, quietly by herself, in a place none of her family could easily find. For a long time, researchers who witnessed behavior like this assumed it was random, an animal wandering off because it was confused or sick or disoriented. But the data they've been accumulating for the last 30 years tells a different story entirely. One that is far harder to explain, and far harder to dismiss. Let's start with what we actually know about how animals handle death, because most of what people assume is wrong. The popular image is grief. Animals mourning publicly, dramatically, staying with the body, refusing to leave. And that does happen. It's real and it's documented, but it's only one part of the picture. The other part, the part almost nobody talks about, is the animals that don't do that, the ones that separate, the ones that go quiet, drift from the group, and disappear before the end arrives, not because they've lost their way, but because, in some way that science is still trying to name, they appear to know. Researchers call it social withdrawal before death, and it shows up across species in a way that is impossible to ignore once you start looking. African elephants are the clearest case, because they've been studied the longest. The Amboseli Elephant Research Project has tracked individual elephants in Kenya for nearly 50 years, accumulating the most complete behavioral record of any large mammal in the wild. What that record shows is this. In the weeks before natural death, elephants frequently begin to separate from the group, not dramatically, not in a way that causes obvious alarm. They fall behind on walks. They spend more time at the edges of the herd rather than the center. They eat less. They move differently. And then, in a number of documented cases, they leave entirely. Cynthia Moss, who has led the Amboseli project for decades, has described watching this happen multiple times. An animal that has been part of a family unit for 30, 40, 50 years, simply walking away from the group in the final days of its life. The family doesn't stop them. They don't chase. In some cases, younger elephants approach the departing animal and touch them with their trunks, a gesture elephants use for comfort and recognition, before stepping back and letting them go. What the research cannot tell us is whether the elephant choosing to leave understands what it's doing, whether there is, somewhere inside that decision, something that resembles intention. What it can tell us is that the behavior is not random. It appears specifically in animals near the end of their lives. It doesn't happen in healthy elephants. The separation is selective, consistent, and repeatable across decades of observation. Elephants aren't the only ones. Wild chimpanzees studied in Uganda showed similar patterns. In the final stages of severe illness, chimps that had been highly social, grooming others, traveling with the group, maintaining the constant physical contact that chimp communities depend on, began withdrawing. They sat apart. They stopped initiating contact. They stopped responding to the approaches of others. Dorothy was a chimpanzee at Cameroon Wildlife Aid Fund who had lived with her group for years. When she died, something happened that nobody had planned for and nobody had seen before. Her group gathered around her body. One by one, they touched her. And then, in the minutes before her body was taken away, several of the chimps sat in silence watching. The image was photographed. It moved around the world. Most people looked at it and saw grief. But there's a detail in that story that almost nobody mentions. In the days before Dorothy died, she had stopped sitting with the others. She had moved quietly to the edges of the space she shared with her group. She had begun, in her own way, to go. Here is the question that the data keeps circling back to without quite being able to land on an answer. Is this about protecting the group? There is a biological argument to be made. A dying animal is a liability, it slows movement, it requires attention from others. In the wild, it can attract predators. An animal that removes itself from the group before death removes that liability. It's a clean, logical, evolutionary explanation, and researchers who are careful with language tend to reach for it first. But there are problems with it. Because the animals doing this are not behaving like animals managing a threat. They are not moving erratically or signaling distress. They are moving deliberately and quietly, in ways that don't match any documented flight or threat response pattern. The elephant researcher Joyce Poole, who has spent 40 years studying elephant communication and emotion, has described the behavior as purposeful in a way that is distinct from anything the survival mechanism explanation fully accounts for. There is also the matter of what happens after. When an elephant dies, the family often returns to the body. Not once, repeatedly. Over days and sometimes weeks, family members come back to where the death occurred, touching the bones with their trunks, standing in silence. This behavior has been documented even when the bones are years old. Elephant families have been observed approaching the remains of animals that died before some of the younger members were born, spending time with them, touching them, before moving on. Poole and Moss have written about witnessing this. The way the family that lost Echo returned to the place where her body was found, standing there together, not moving, not making sound. Just present, in a place that meant something to them for a reason that science can describe but cannot fully explain. If the withdrawal before death were purely about removing a liability from the group would have no reason to return. The problem would be solved. There would be nothing to go back for. And yet they go back. There is a harder question underneath all of this, one that researchers tend to approach carefully, because the stakes of getting it wrong in either direction are high. Do these animals know they are dying? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we may not be able to know, at least not with the tools currently available. What we can say is this: the animals that withdraw share certain characteristics. They are old, they are ill, their behavior changes in the days and weeks before death in ways that are consistent and not explained by the illness alone. They move away from the things that have defined their entire lives, their family, their social bonds, the constant physical proximity that elephants and chimps and many other species depend on, at precisely the moment when those things are about to end. Whether that timing is coincidence, or instinct, or something else entirely, is a question the data cannot settle. We watch animals do this, and we feel something specific. Most people who learn about Echo, or Dorothy, or any of the dozens of documented cases like them, feel a recognition they weren't prepared for. Because humans do this too. Not all of us. Not always. But the research on human end-of-life behavior shows that social withdrawal is one of the most consistent signs that death is approaching. People who are dying often become quieter. They stop initiating conversation. They spend more time in silence. They sometimes say goodbye in ways that seem premature, before anyone around them has fully accepted what is happening. Hospice workers describe it in terms that sound familiar: a turning inward, a going somewhere else while still physically present, a quality of attention that has shifted away from the living world and towards something that can't be named. We have no word for what this is in animals. We barely have a word for what it is in humans. Echo walked away from her family in the dark, before dawn, without waking anyone. She died alone under an acacia tree, several kilometers from the herd she had led for decades. Her family found the place where she had been. They returned to it. They stood there together for a long time. What they were doing in those moments, whether it was grief, or ritual, or simply presence, is something the science can gesture toward but not reach. What we know is that they came back. What we know is that she had gone somewhere to be alone, and they came back to the place she had chosen, and they stood there in silence, the way living things stand in the presence of something they cannot explain but know, somehow, to honor. The animal that chooses to die alone is not abandoning its family. Maybe it is, in the only way available to it, trying to spare them something. Or maybe it is doing what all living things do at the edge of what they can understand. Going quiet, turning inward, making peace with the dark before it arrives. We don't know, and that finally is the most honest thing that can be said.